Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your source material and distill the key insights so you can cut straight to being well-informed. Today, we are opening up a really fascinating set of sources that analyze one of the highest-stakes ideological clashes in modern history. Some experts even call it the millennium endgame.
That phrase, it sounds dramatic, but it really fits. This wasn't just another Cold War skirmish. As the 20th century was closing, you had these three massive ideological blocks emerge, and each one was absolutely convinced they had the blueprint to profoundly change global life, to establish the New World Order.
We're talking about a once-in-a-thousand-years competition.
Exactly.
And the contenders. On one side, you have the Leninist Marxist East, with Mikhail Gorbachev, a master of political optics, at the helm.
Right. Then you have the Western globalists, the capitalists, whose power is all about money and technology.
And then, the real outlier in all of this, the Roman Catholic Church, led by Pope John Paul II, Karol Wojtyla.
And you know what's so jarring when you first look at this? It's how agreeable they all sounded.
What do you mean?
Well, whether you picked up a declaration from the Kremlin or from Wall Street or the Vatican, they were all using the same words: individual freedom, liberation, human dignity. They all claim that man, the individual, was the measure of their designs.
Which is such a brilliant observation. The language was the same, but the intent was worlds apart. So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack the unique geopolitical strategy that John Paul II deployed, contrast it with the secular visions of his opponents, and expose the core ideological conflict that was driving this entire endgame.
Okay, let's get into it. To understand John Paul II, I think we first have to understand the two secular titans he was facing, and critically, their limitations.
Right. Let's start with the Leninist Marxists, especially under Gorbachev. What was their ideological foundation when it came to the individual?
Well, their foundation was, let's say, rigid and pretty fragile. For Leninist Marxism, individual rights weren't inherent at all. They were determined and granted solely by the monopolar government.
So the whole point of a citizen's rights was just to keep the party in power.
Exactly. To ensure the Communist Party remained supreme and permanent. Any dignity you had was conditional on serving the party line.
And Gorbachev's rise to power, it wasn't driven by some renewed faith in that system, was it? The sources suggest he was basically in a triage situation.
Absolutely. He wasn't reforming out of idealism. He was reforming out of pure necessity. He completely understood the systemic internal illnesses that were just plaguing the USSR.
Like what, specifically?
Severe economic stagnation, industrial ineptitude, and a really deep technological deficiency compared to the West. He knew he had to engage the West or face a total systemic collapse.
So this wasn't an ideological reform drive at all. It was a survival mission, purely driven by financial and technological need, which forced him to engage the West on their terms.
Yes. Meanwhile, you have the Western globalist vision.
The wise men and the capitalists, what was their angle?
They anchored their power on two things: money and technology. And they defined individual rights based on something called positive law.
Meaning whatever laws a voting majority passes.
Right. It sounds, maximally democratic. But the sources point out that the ultimate rule, the complex systems of finance, of policy, that all remains very far removed from the ordinary individual. The power structures are still centralized, just democratically sanctioned.
And this is where the strategic genius of Gorbachev really comes to the surface. He saw that weakness, that sort of ponderous democratic process, and he leveraged his personal charisma to force the West into a complete 180-degree reversal of its 70-year containment policy toward the USSR.
It was less like diplomacy and more like a masterclass in psychological warfare.
So how did he actually manage that reversal?
He basically performed a global public relations coup. He cultivated this Gorby mania, not just with the public, but among key world leaders.
And the critical moment?
It was when he literally hijacked the Group of Seven meeting. The G7 was designed to coordinate Western economic policy against the Soviet threat.
And he just showed up.
Well, not exactly. He forced himself onto the agenda, not by invitation, but by generating such overwhelming public and political pressure that they couldn't ignore him. He forced the G7 to stop planning containment and start negotiating assistance. It was just a stunning demonstration of political optics winning over entrenched strategy.
And that masterful move really exposed the core structural weakness of the Western globalists. The sources highlight they were still grappling with this fundamental question.
Which was?
Could their system of democratic egalitarianism ever organically evolve into a unified geopolitical structure that could act decisively on the world stage?
So if I'm hearing this right, the sources are saying the Western system is fantastic at generating wealth and individual rights at home, but its underlying democratic philosophy.
The need for consensus,
Yeah.
shifting priorities.
All that complex legislative process, it actually hinders it from acting as a swift, unified global player. It's a structural evolution that the other two contenders, with their centralized authority, had already solved. In their own rigid ways, of course.
Which brings us right back to the central tension. This competition was definitive. It wasn't about compromise or finding a middle ground.
No. Each contender knew that only one design, only one definition of what humanity is, could ultimately be the victor in this millennium endgame.
And that takes us to the third contender, the Vatican.
Which occupied a position unlike any other. The sources describe it as the world's only existing and fully operating geo-religious institution. Its power base was entirely non-secular.
The sources refer to the basis of this power as the keys of this blood. Can we pause there? What does that phrase functionally grant the Pope in geopolitical terms that say money on missiles don't? It sounds like very specialized jargon.
It is, but it's crucial. It's the ultimate claim to autonomous, centralized authority. The keys of this blood symbolizes a unique, transcendent authority guaranteed by Christ's sacrificial blood. Functionally, it means the Vatican doesn't need a UN vote, a functioning economy, or a military alliance to assert moral and spiritual leadership on a global scale. It claims a unique right to intervene because its legitimacy comes from outside the entire geopolitical system.
And John Paul II, Carol Wojtyla, he was personally and profoundly prepared for this massive role.
I mean, his long training in Nazi and then Stalinist Poland meant he had faced down the most abject socio-political systems the world had yet devised.
So he came to the papacy already pre-seasoned by confrontation with brute power. He was uniquely qualified to oppose these ideological titans.
And yet, one of the most surprising insights from all this is the Pope's conscious policy of inaction when it came to internal church reform.
Really?
As early as 1980, he was making these calculated decisions, realizing that reform of the rapidly deteriorating church was, in his words, an impossibility at that stage.
So he essentially prioritized the external geopolitical struggle, the fight for the global soul, over the internal geopolitics of faith. Why make that calculation?
He believed that success in defeating the external totalitarian ideologies would ultimately create the necessary space and context to then address the internal crisis.
But that choice allowed a dangerous internal conflict to fester.
Yes, the rise of a superforce, or what the sources call the anti-church within the church.
Okay, what did this anti-church superforce actually do to undermine his authority?
They sought to nullify the Patrine office through non-exercise. It was subtle. Instead of outright rebellion, they just implemented choke points in communication and interpretation.
Give me an example.
Okay, so when the Pope issued instructions intended to allow the celebration of the traditional Tridentine Mass, high-ranking churchmen would just interpret those instructions as being optional for local bishops.
So they just water it down.
Exactly. Or they would dismiss his encyclicals, which are supposed to define core church teaching, as mere personal meditations of the Pontiff. They were trying to neutralize his doctrinal authority while keeping up a veneer of loyalty.
So he was fighting a war on multiple fronts, but consciously chose to focus his direct efforts outward, fundamentally convinced that God had a design for the world that was just utterly at odds with the earthly utopias imagined by the secular globalists.
And that conviction led directly into his revolutionary strategy, which of course began in his homeland, Poland.
John Paul II used Poland as the spearhead to challenge Leninist Marxism, not with tanks, but with culture and spirit.
And his primary instrument was solidarity. But the sources are very clear to emphasize that this was not a political movement, at least not initially.
Why was that distinction so important?
It was devised purely as a model of sociocultural liberty and what they call religious nationalism, pointedly avoiding any formal political role. That was crucial because he was deliberately avoiding the tripwire that would automatically invite a Soviet military backlash. The Polish hierarchy, they were past masters at confronting brute power. They knew exactly how far they could push.
You can see this strategy play out so clearly in his incredibly dramatic 1979 visit to Poland.
Oh, it's an amazing moment.
He's confronted by this heavy government military presence. We're talking tanks and soldiers lining the streets, and he maintains total control by just joking.
He says, "I am sure that there are people out there who are already having a hard time taking this Slavic pope.
A joke is a weapon. It's incredible. He didn't offer a political threat. He offered an identity statement rooted in something far deeper than tanks.
That level of serene confidence must have been absolutely devastating to the totalitarian military presence there.
And beyond Poland, John Paul II launched this sweeping moral critique of the entire global structure, which he famously labeled sinful structures.
Right. He argued that any structure created solely for economic, financial, political, or ideological gain, without any reference to God, inherently violates the first commandment. It becomes the worship of false gods.
He turned his moral gaze into a map of shame.
A powerful phrase.
And this map highlighted institutionalized exploitation. He specifically called out the North-South division, pointing to the staggering global debt crisis. Can you give us some specifics on the scale of that crisis he was describing?
He was citing nations like Bolivia, whose debt relief depended entirely on payments from a hyperinflated Argentina, creating this house of cards, or the case of oil-rich nations like Venezuela and Nigeria.
You'd think they would be fine.
You would,
Yeah.
but they were crippled by staggering, unpayable foreign debts that forced them into a kind of perpetual servitude to global financial systems. He saw the structure itself, the whole mechanism of global finance, as inherently immoral.
And he didn't spare the West either. He heavily criticized their policy of balance and polite neighborly relations with the Soviet East. He called it the principle of moral equivalence.
He argued that this approach, treating the tyrannical Soviet East as a political equal just for the sake of stability, it allowed the unjust, godless structures of the Eastern Bloc to clone themselves all through Eastern Europe.
It legitimized systems built on suffering.
He said the West's failure to condemn totalitarianism outright was, in fact, a moral capitulation.
It's fascinating because at the same time, the Soviet East was adapting to this moral pressure. The sources suggest that Gorbachev's new thinking was built on the forgotten work of an old Sardinian Marxist, Antonio Gramsci.
Yes, Gramsci. He advocated for the nonviolent penetration and Marxization of the West. His strategy, which became known as piggyback tactics or liberation theology, was genius in its subtlety.
It wasn't about sending in tanks.
Not at all. It was about infiltrating and leavening Western cultural and political institutions, academia, media, even churches like yeast in bread. The goal was to make Marxist goals appear to be the natural evolutionary result of secular social progress.
But you remove the need for a bloody revolution.
Precisely. And Gorbachev needed this new thinking to integrate with and ultimately penetrate the Western globalist mindset.
This entire ideological clash really culminated in a truly dramatic moment. The Vatican summit in December 1989.
John Paul II and Mikhail Gorbachev.
Gorbachev was there seeking legitimacy, seeking help with serious internal trouble spots like Lithuania and Ukraine. He recognized the Pope not just as a religious figure, but as a potentate with overwhelming, unassailable moral influence.
It was a transaction between two veterans of the endgame, matching mind to mind, intention to intention. They were operating on a grand geopolitical scale. They knew all the major players on the world chessboard: Western Europe, the struggling USSR, the USA, and the growing PRC.
But despite their mutual respect, their ultimate hole cards, their final bets, remained fundamentally opposed. What was the source of John Paul II's confidence?
His reliance was on, well, a heavenly intervention and the evocation of an utterly new state of consciousness in all of mankind, a transcendent change. He was banking on the spiritual reality of man to win the war.
Whereas Gorbachev's trump card was his unwavering belief in Leninist socialism as the inevitable result of civilization's development.
Historical determinism, the belief that history must bend toward their secular utopia.
And this is the core ideological battle that John Paul II identified. The entire secular trend, exemplified by Gorbachev's charisma and the subtle appeal of humanism. This trend aims for an entirely earthly utopia,
where the sole purpose of life is material happiness, completely divorced from the transcendent.
John Paul II had a really stark image for the cost of that purely materialistic pursuit. He described this secularism as the soul-killing watery serum that was replacing the blood of culture in the West.
That is an unforgettable image for spiritual depletion, focusing only on the immanent.
And what happened next was just astonishing. The Soviet system imploded with a speed that proved the initial geopolitical timetable that Wyszynski and Wojtyla had formulated.
They had anticipated a slow erosion over decades.
It was completely inaccurate. The change came violently and so rapidly.
Yeah, the map changed quickly, but did the heart change? That's the question. Václav Havel, the president of Czechoslovakia, speaking at the Davos meeting around that time, offered a powerful summation that rings just as true today.
What did he say?
He acknowledged that political systems change, but he insisted, without a global revolution in the sphere of human consciousness, nothing will change for the better.
He put his finger precisely on the failure point exposed by the whole millennium endgame.
He did. He noted that despite the political revolution, we still don't know how to put morality ahead of politics, science, and economics. The structures built solely on profit, on power, on material gain, they remain primary, regardless of which flag flies over them.
So we saw the rapid collapse of the Soviet utopia, but Havel points out that the spiritual and moral core of the global structure, well, it remained untouched. If John Paul II believes secularism was that soul-killing watery serum, the question for you, the listener, remains. In the face of global structures that aim only for consumption and material happiness, what is the ultimate moral foundation strong enough to withstand the lure of an entirely secular, imminent vision of the future?
Something to ponder as you observe the geopolitical forces shaping the world today.